Good morning, everyone. I'm Emily Akhtarzandi, Managing Director of Atlantic Live, the events division of The Atlantic, and I'm happy to welcome you all to Access to Power, a forum on energy equity. A few notes before we get started. We're on Twitter at Atlantic. You can join today's conversation using the hashtag NextAmerica. And we're also live streaming the conversation today at atlantic.com. Families and underserved communities are struggling to pay their monthly utility bill. This is especially true for people of color and renters who live in multifamily units where buildings are not updated to meet energy efficiency standards. On average, low-income households pay more than 3 times the amount that higher-income households pay. Investments from both the public and private sector. What will it take to ensure that the benefits of energy innovation are extended to all communities and consumers? So we'll dive into this issue today, and to illuminate this topic, we've brought together a wide-ranging group, community leaders to socially minded entrepreneurs, to government officials, and the private sector. Together, they'll discuss how to create a more equitable, clean energy future for all Americans. But before we begin, I'd like to take this Atlantic Next America Forum possible, and I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Melissa Lavinson, Vice President of Federal Affairs and Politics. Melissa Lavinson, Vice President of Federal Affairs and Politics. So Melissa, welcome.
Great. Well, thank you, Emily. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here this morning. And this is a pretty amazing turnout, which just lets me know that this, again, is a really together to solve. And I'm looking forward to this timely discussion on energy equity led by Ron Brownstein and The Atlantic, and to hear from the great slate of panelists and speakers that we have. You know, as someone who's been in the energy industry now for the past 20 plus years, I can safely say that are becoming more decarbonized, more digitized, and more dispersed. And this is due to a variety of factors, including technology and innovation deployment, regulatory policy, tax policy, changing consumer, really driving a lot of this, and changing demographics, among others. And the changes have been generally positive for millions of Americans and for the country. We've seen a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, increased energy efficiency and increased energy productivity, lower commodity costs, improved air quality, more customer choice, autonomy and transparency, and increased energy security for the nation. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been challenges and that there don't continue to be challenges. And it doesn't mean that everyone has benefited equally from all these incredible innovations. So a couple of the challenges that we see are the following. Technology and markets, they're evolving. And this has the potential to impact the sustainability, effectiveness, and success of a lot of these efforts. There are increasing concerns about the overall system reliability and about information security. More investments are definitely needed to make the underlying infrastructure, which is that grid platform, to make this new energy system work. But finding a way to equitably pay for this grid platform, that's been elusive. We haven't really figured that out yet. We're seeing a displacement of workers from one industry to another, and sometimes this is exacerbating local economic challenges, so we have to address this as we move forward. And as Emily mentioned, not all consumers have equal, or they don't even have the right information to make the right choices for themselves. So at PG&E, we thought that this was a really important topic, and we really wanted to host this conversation in partnership with Ron Brownstein and The Atlantic, because primarily as a California company headquartered in San Francisco, we are seeing both the and the extreme challenges of this changing landscape firsthand. And we're seeing the impacts on energy consumers, and we serve the Central Valley. So what that means is we have some of the most affluent, technology savvy, energy sophisticated, and make the system work for everyone. And it's our belief that all consumers and all communities that are available to us. And we also believe that failure to do so is not an option. You know, the stakes are just too high for both the people we serve and the planet we live on. So on behalf of the 23,000 men and women of PG&E, I again want to thank The Atlantic for hosting today's event and for tackling this extremely important issue. You know, we've got all Americans have access to clean, affordable, safe, and reliable energy. And that's what we strive to do every day at PG&E for our 16 million customers throughout Northern and Central California, regardless of where they live, who they are, or their income level. So thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Our first engagement and outreach can help empower low-income consumers to tap into resources that will plug them into this conversation are Michelle Moore, Chief Executive Officer of Groundswell, Jackie Patterson, Director of Environment and Climate Justice Program of NAACP, and Ted Tribue, Director of the District of Columbia Sustainable. Rebecca Rosen will moderate this panel. So Rebecca, the floor is yours. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. We're actually gonna, before we kick off our panel conversation, we're gonna watch a quick video that looks at the energy burden facing low-income residents. So I think we're just gonna cue that up.
I have had problems in the past paying for the utilities simply because they're exorbitant. I mean, or you stay cool. It gets really frustrating when you spend most of your time working to make money just really to meet the bills. And then when you pay your bills, you still don't have enough to cover it.
I felt helpless. I felt like we're going to lose the house. You have to have these essential things running in order to live. And here we had kids living here with us, you know, my grandkids, and it was just difficult. I didn't want them to see us not being able to help them out.
I've gone to my church for help in the past, and they've been extremely generous in helping to make sure my lights stay on because earlier they were going to go off.
The Energy Assistance Program here began a number of years ago. I was approached by one of the city council persons who asked me if we would be willing to house a program here. So it's a city program. Their city actually run the program. Our church provides within this issue. There's an important issue.
I was all in for the panels to be installed. I never felt like we wouldn't benefit from it. You know, I kind of believe in this, you know. With everything that's going on with the energy companies, and we've lived 2 weeks without any power.
It's growing, and the more people that receive these panels is doing the environment good, and they're doing their wallet good. I make it my priority, but my priority is to pay them. And thank God they're not delinquent, you know, but that's why I'm so grateful to work and have a job.
I'm just hoping that that the bills will be lower than they are, and that's like a tremendous break for us.
So the video we just saw really relates to the work that my panelists up here do. We're going to start by hearing from each of them, and at some point we'll open it up to questions from the audience as well. But the basic idea here is that low-income communities are facing this disproportionate energy burden. It's not even just that energy bills take up a larger percent of their household's budget of their home. Can you guys talk about what we saw in the video, this energy burden, and how it relates to the work you're doing? We can just start at Michelle and work down the line.
Sure. The experience that Monet shared in the video is one that lots of people face. In the city of Baltimore, where she lives, almost $100 plus per month for their electricity bills. Now that's a lot if you're not making very much money, but that's a lot, period. And it's really a call to action from our perspective. And we see the faith community, just like Reverend Wharton is being critical, used to value, but also just like Reverend Wharton's church, in many communities, places that you go in the winter when your kids need a coat. And so to partner with the faith community is really fundamental to the neighborhoods, is an extraordinarily important way to reach out to people and help them understand not only what kind of opportunities there are to help them lower their bills, because in many cases there are a lot of programs, but they're just a challenge to work through. It's extraordinary work that they're doing, particularly Ted here in DC with some of the success stories that they have.
And what is Groundswell's role in that relationship between communities and faith groups, and what is the other work you're doing? How does it?
So Groundswell is a nonprofit. We build community power. We've been working since 2009 to engage low-income communities and small sustainable energy utility, working to help people move into cleaner wind power, where it provides them opportunities to help low-income families and renters be able to participate in clean energy in a way that really builds community resilience, builds local economic strength and community wealth. But very importantly as well, and I think that this is something that we can't really miss when we think about the people, who are just like I think in so many things in our lives, you just kind of feel done to and extracted from all the time. As a part of this broader narrative around economic equity and community solar like energy efficiency, but in a more visible kind of something you can feel way, as a way that people can take more control, over something that's costing them a whole lot more, and it also has very disproportionate public health impacts, which Jackie has been extraordinarily important in articulating the story around.
So let's turn that over to Jackie. Can you talk about what you're working on with these issues?
Yeah, sure. So we're the intersection, as you said before, with the energy burden. There are kind of more than a few factors in terms of why the energy burden is stock, and the fact that a lot of the energy, or whether it's heat, leaves the facility because of its windows, ceiling, and that kind of thing. And so then that makes higher costs. But then also in some cases, obviously when the income is lower, then the ratio of cost to income is greater. So that's what we're working on, addressing everything from advancing energy efficiency so that folks have actual access to retrofits and weatherization that they need to be able to make their properties more energy efficient. We also have been working on this transition to clean energy because we don't want to just see the situation be better for low-income people. We actually want to see a lifting of the income status of people as part of this agenda. So we explicitly see the distributed generation of energy and the fact that folks can actually own a part of our energy infrastructure as a key component of the work that we do. So we see that as asset building and wealth building at the individual and at the local level in the case of community solar.
Yeah. Ted, can you talk about what your work is here in the district and how it kind of intersects with what Michelle and Jackie have discussed?
Sure. Thank you for having me. The utility has been going on here in the city for about 5 years. We are a contractor to the District Department of the Environment. And so what we do through that solar programs, primarily in low-income single-family solar installations, multifamily solar installations, as well as some commercial solar. But in addition to that, the work has a huge social equity component built into it, where we are training and delivering jobs for district residents in the economy a year here in the city. 30% of that funding is spent in the low-income community. We also have an emphasis on using local businesses to do the actual installation work, called certified business enterprises. But the magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with here is staggering, quite frankly. Yeah. In the District of Columbia, I'm proud to be a fourth-generation Washingtonian, we have over 22,000 families who are currently registered for heating assistance programs with the city, energy assistance programs. There are thousands of families who are just above the income, struggle just as mightily with their bills here in the District of Columbia. So the numbers here in the city, I'm sure in Baltimore as well, are quite large. This isn't an isolated problem to a very small portion of our community. This is a large problem. We're sitting here, probably the nation's capital, our Capitol building. There are public housing units. within a half a mile of a walk from here. So this is something that is right here in our midst. The solar, the video you showed earlier and the lady getting the solar panels is interesting. We, for the last 5 years, have run a program where we install at no cost to the homeowner solar panels on the roof. This is not an easy sell. When you go up to somebody's door and you say, knock, 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 hey, you know, we're here with some free solar panels, will you just let us in for 6 hours? That door slams. If you call them up on the phone, hey, we've got the phone gets slammed down. They've been sold a bill of goods before and they don't believe that you're bringing essentially $12,000 worth of technology to them for free. That, you know, this is too good to be true. It can't be. And so what happens is you struggle in communities. And George Nichols is here in the audience, and he started this program. We thought that if we could go out with absolutely no marketing budget available, Groundswell was working with us to go and identify residents who would accept these solar panels. We thought at the end of the summer, if we could do 20 installations, we would declare success. I think we did about 87 that year. Last year, we installed 137. This year, we'll do somewhat over 140 sets of solar panels here in the District of Columbia. As well, in addition to that, we've probably done 5 times the installed capacity in the multifamily and part for us was 5 years ago when we took a look at the District of Columbia and we mapped out all of the wards. In the wealthier sections of town, there are about 75,000 people in every ward here in the city. In some of the wealthier sections, you had 400 or 500 sets of solar panels per ward. But in Ward 7 and 8 combined, a total of 150 sets of solar panels in that entire community. And so that's where we started.
That was 5 years ago.
5 years ago, that's where we started. The landscape now is evened out incredibly because we've installed over 500 sets of solar panels here in the District of Columbia, and all of those on single-family, low-income residences.
Yeah.
That hesitation to understand that this is really a deal that can significantly reduce the cost of electricity in the home by 30 to 50% on average, and that it can be provided free of charge. We have an incredibly robust.
Can you say what the SREC is?
Oh, sure. Solar renewable energy credits that are available in some states, not all, in the nation, but it is a very, very it's a help in the nation.
Great. Jackie, can you talk about how does the district kind of stack up?
Yeah, well, as Ted said, it really compared to some other places. There's certainly an increasing policy landscape that's supporting the proliferation of distributed generation, but not in some places it's very restrictive. There's a legislature that is actively pushing against distributed generation. We've seen in DC, and other places where there is, whether it's California or New Jersey, these are places where there's actually been a pretty significant boom in terms of proliferation of distributed generation. So it varies quite a bit. And I wouldn't say, I'm trying to think regionally, a way of avail as a result, because I think some folks see it as too much too fast, and there's a concern about how the utility business model is going to be able to support this advancement. So.
Right. I mean, besides like the natural availability of sunlight, you have the policy landscape, and I'm sure that's pretty much controlling.
Right. It's interesting. Our parent company, Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, got started. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We got started in this business over 30 years ago under the premise of just what you laid out earlier, that the economic burden on low-income residents is much higher for utilities than it is for other residents. So we've run the statewide energy efficiency programs in Vermont, in several municipalities in Ohio, and we were operating these solar programs in New Jersey as well, with another state with a very, very robust solar market. But we like to say that our solar installed capacity here is probably the largest per capita low-income solar market on the East Coast. Wow. California has a very, very good program. I think you'll hear later on from Grid Alternatives that works both here and in California, and I think several other states as well.
If I could jump in as well and just share a perspective linking, because clearly the policy environment is incredibly important in shaping the opportunities to engage with communities, period. You gotta have something to go talk to people about, and that sets the play. But when we're talking about community engagement, and I think that also when we just observe how, this is a broad conversation about what some of the solutions might be for low-income families, but an element of helping our neighbors, really to reduce their generated in a way that's doing justice to them and their bodies and their health. That's a people opportunity too. It's not just about policy. It's about people. And how do we create people-centric innovation, for communities of people who have been so done to, over time that they don't even believe you when $12,000 worth of solar panels. When you have people who are going to the church, to help them pay their utility bills, and people in many cases too who are working multiple jobs on hourly wages that are less predictable, on less predictable schedules, and don't have the time to invest. And figuring one of the most interesting statistics to me in this whole space is something that Accenture came up with, I think last year. The average American, and talking about average anything is kind of misses a lot of important details, right? But the average American spends something like 9 minutes a year on their utility bill. 9 minutes a year interacting with their utilities, which is not much when you think about a cost that is 10% of the entire household income for the poorest families in this country. So there's an opportunity there to think about how do we really reach people, and how do we use the knowledge that we have and the connections that we have. Too, there's another P word, partnerships that are incredibly important to bring to the table too, with the exception of NAACP. Up here, nonprofits like us, working primarily in the Mid-Atlantic, relatively small, and when counting our customers in the thousands as compared to an institution like PG&E, which counts as customers in the millions. And so they're extraordinarily important opportunities for local like NAAC chapters around the country, to be able to work together with bigger institutions like utilities, like the DC SEU, as a big nonprofit with their parent VEIC and partners with the local DOEE, DC Department of Energy and Environment, to get this good work out there. Because when we're talking about energy, when we're talking about clean energy in particular and efficiency technology, it's really a basic necessity for quality of life, and I would argue even for civilization. And it's an opportunity for us to demonstrate that we're all in this together, solutions that we can work on in partnership.
We've spent a bit of importance of efficiency measures. I know DCSEU is doing a lot on efficiency. Can you talk about your work on that end?
Sure. We operate about 12 different initiatives here in the District of Columbia to things of that nature within unit by unit in the buildings. We probably serve about 15,000 residences per year through that program. Another program is called our Multifamily Comprehensive Program, where a lot of the old go back in and return those older buildings to low to moderate income uses. And so during the rehabilitation of those structures, we will go in and help work with the construction companies to design energy efficient systems throughout the building. It's a comprehensive approach of air sealing, appliances, and the like. Lighting is what we call the low-hanging fruit, the mother lode. Everybody has lighting.
Yep.
And so really helping to transform those buildings in a way that when the occupants return to them, they are already suited for I think we brought online the first almost net zero multifamily building here in the District of Columbia. Just bought it online last year.
Wow,
so
where
there's a lot of out of the very end of Benning Road.
Wow.
In Northeast. So there's a lot of innovation going on in this space right now. We're very proud to be at the forefront of it.
And it really goes to what Michelle was saying, that efficiency shouldn't be a privilege, especially when you're looking at it from a justice perspective of people who really audience for questions. I think we've got some people with holding mics, so they'll be, so any questions for our?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ethan Goffman with Earth Talk and the SSPP blog. My impression for a long time has been that the lowest hanging fruit was energy audits and sealing up buildings, and that once that's done, then you worry about solar, and especially with low income where you have a lot of buildings that might be leaking quite a bit. Is that still true? Because solar has come down. So it seems like, to me, that would be the priority, but maybe it's no longer the case. So.
No, Ethan, I think that the premise is correct. I would say that the lowest hanging fruit in the building after you're doing your audit is an analysis. Your audit is going to show you where the opportunities exist for energy efficiency in the building. I know we love to talk about solar because solar is sexy, but I think Ethan is right. When we get into these buildings, you know, nobody calls you and says, "Hey man, come on over and see my new insulation," or, "I've got some pipe wraps going on here. You really need to see it." I can call you over, but you're right. We go in, and when we go in unit by unit into most of these buildings, that's what we're primarily dealing with first and foremost. Air sealing, replacing the faucet aerators, replacing the shower heads. Now, I know you're saying, well, that's attacking water. The less water you use, the energy it takes to heat the water. So we're attacking the water problems. We're wrapping up exposed pipe. And these are things that are common to all of the units. We can even do this without the energy audits that Ethan is talking about. And so, but then when you get into a more comprehensive view, yes, it is good to have those audits. We have something called a benchmark of Columbia that kicked in about 2 to 3 years ago, which for the first time can actually show us on a comparative basis, building by building, per square foot, how much energy you are consuming here versus the building of the similar size right next door, how much energy they're consuming. And so we go to the building owners and say, you know, Michelle, your building is consuming 3 times as much energy as the guys right next door. Michelle is now motivated to take action and cure some of the things that might ail her building. And so that benchmarking law, which has been passed in several cities now, I know New York started it, I think the District of Columbia was second, San Francisco has it as well, and Chicago. These are some of the things that are pieces of the work on the buildings as well.
I would just add to your point that solar is sexy. I would just encourage us to think about solar and efficiency as a both and, as opposed to an either. And because solar is something you can see and you can take pride in, and you can feel like you own a piece of that, whereas energy efficiency is kind of invisible and behind the walls. And sexy from a cost savings perspective, but hard to see. Sometimes solar, a starting point in a conversation, is a way to engage people about their energy bill overall and get folks to understand that there are things and there are programs here in DC and Baltimore and different places around the country that can help lead them into lowering their utility bills. So whereas it might not be the most policy efficient economic solution, there's a human component of it that can really help to open up conversations that might otherwise be a little bit more challenging to have.
In the back.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Dell. I'm from the Department of Energy. An issue that has long faced low-income people in paying their utility bill, low-income Americans, is service terminations in their utility. And so I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about what are the options or what people are thinking about to terminations and the threat of service terminations, given that even brief interruptions of utility service can have very serious impacts on family income, on the education of children in the family, on family health, things like that.
I have to comment on this briefly, and I'm going to pass this to my colleagues very quickly. I used to be the vice president of PEPCO here in the District of Columbia. I did that for 7 years, and in that role, not a week went by, often not a day went by, that I didn't get a phone call from a customer who was frantic, from a council member calling on behalf of a constituent who was facing a service termination. It is a really, really daunting experience. You have food in your refrigerator when you have children in your home, to face the prospect of spending a night, forget the temperatures outside that can get extremely hot or cold at times here in the city, but just spending a night completely in the dark. And so the situation you present is very real. I'm going to turn this over to some of my colleagues.
Clearly, the challenge that families face from service termination, would be incredibly disruptive to lifestyle, would be incredibly disruptive to the economic and potentially health of families. If you look at some of the statistics around the impacts of energy insecurity, it includes impacts on communities that also have and all sorts of other health impacts. I think that when we look at the holistic landscape of how we respond to the needs of low-income communities with energy efficiency, with clean energy, and also in that spirit of partnership, how we think of utilities as resources that were really set up for the public good. I do believe that we have opportunities to be able to improve the delivery of programs that exist today, like the ones that Reverend Wharton talked about, mentioned, to make sure that people who are in need
Can you explain what that was?
I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it's basically a low-income
Heating,
assistance
yeah.
program to help pay your bills. So that people who have that need are connected immediately to what the opportunities are. Because I think that there's tremendous good intention, and there are decades and decades of programs that have been developed from a technical perspective, from a policy perspective, to make sure people's basic needs are met. But the dots aren't always connected in terms of making sure that people at the local level and communities know what they have access to. The great work of the SCU, the great work of NAACP and its chapters, and many other organizations that you'll hear represented today have the ability to provide that connective tissue to the community to make sure that we are meeting people's needs and human perspective. It's almost easier to do the economic analysis to meet people's needs. But given the focus on this issue and the extraordinary turnout at the event today as an example of that, and the fact that one of the most progressive utilities chosen this week by Newsweek as the greenest utility in the country is here today sponsoring this, I think is an indication of what the potential is to being able to use this moment in time in our country when we're making this very significant energy transition to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our neighbors who are most in need.
And from the utilities perspective, as I sat there, it's your last resort. It's not the first thing you want to do. That is really the last thing you want to do, is a termination for a resident. You know the pain that causes. We feel it ourselves. And so it really is, as the lady said from the Department of Energy, it's the last resort. You don't want, it's the road you don't want to go down.
So I'll just add a little comment that on Friday we launched as the NAACP our first Energy Justice Certification Program, and we did it with a 2-day training that we'll be doing throughout the country in terms of 4 regional trainings. And in the context of that conversation, we had folks who were coming in from Hawaii, from Alaska, from Arizona, and all of the western states. And one of the persons was talking about a situation where she had a challenge with her utility company around a service interruption. Came an electrician, installed solar panels on her roof, and said, so these are the kind of ways, and as I said before, in terms of building wealth, building assets, and building autonomy and control, so you don't have someone who can flip a switch and make you, put you in the dark. And so we really see this as again, a justice issue.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to my panelists up here. That's all the time we have for this morning. It's been great speaking with you, and thank you to the audience too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. The ways in which consumers and utilities have typically interacted has been transformed by the clean energy revolution, even as more and more consumers harness the power of renewable energy to provide lighting and heat to their homes. A large segment of energy users that are being left behind. What can states do to ensure that underserved communities have access to clean power? So joining us on stage for this next conversation are Richard Kaufman, the Chairman of Energy and Finance for New York Office of Governor Andrew. And here to lead this interview.
Good morning, Mr. Czar. Thank you for joining us. Forming the energy vision, touching on many aspects of the energy equation in the state. Give us a little sense of how the project came about and the scope of what it is dealing with.
Well, I was working in Washington for Secretary of Energy Chu. I got a call from Governor Cuomo, and it was during Hurricane Sandy, just after Hurricane Sandy, and the governor had been in the dark and cold with many suffering New Yorkers, and he told me that the utility industry was vinyl record in the age of the iPad. And So he asked me to come to New York and help reinvent the power sector. And he was not just talking about resiliency, he was also talking about affordability. The system is increasingly unaffordable for everybody. So it's the 10 years headed to $30 billion in the next 10 years, and it's not making the system any smarter or more resilient. And then the system is not responsive to, just we heard about in the last panel, to changing consumer demands.
Yeah. You know, I've white papers, there have been a lot of regulatory proceedings. This has a lot of components to it. What are the core ideas? What are the core ways in which you are trying
today? The grid today of Tesla and Westinghouse. It's a one-way grid, electronic from large power plants through to hundreds of miles to us as consumers. And what's happened is that grid we're not building that grid. And the reason why we're not building that grid is we have a policy regime that's just of the system is 54%, which is a really low number. And what it also means is when we think about the adoption of technology, the realization of the system is 54%, which is a really low number. And what it also means is when we think about the adoption of technology, to deploy that. And that's not a fault of the utilities, that's a fault of the policy regime around it.
So what have you learned about what are the kinds of incentives that would in fact encourage the deployment and the adoption of the technologies that you want to see adopted?
So maybe just a couple of other sort of statistics just to make it clear. I talked about this low average capacity utilization. Utilities spend 0.2% of sales on R&D. 0.2%. Other industries, you know, they spend 10% of sales. So it's not because there aren't great opportunities, it's because the policies have not permitted the utilities to make those kinds of investments. On the utility bill, the average utility bill, 93% of the utility bill costs are just a pass-through from the utility to customers. The only profit opportunity is about 7%. In other businesses, companies would say, well, if we can reduce costs to customers and earn some of that, we should do that. It's a kind of, that 93% is seen as a wallet share. But that hasn't been an opportunity for utilities. And that's one of the reasons why, again, the environment is not for utilities. And we're changing all that. So just to maybe, distributed solutions really matter depending on location, because the grid has different. In for those customers, deploy those the opportunity to earn some of the.
It's a very ambitious goal. Primarily through. You
can't just financially and energy inefficient. So 50% renewables also means a tremendous focus on energy efficiency. So we do expect, and the reason why the governor has set this out as a mandate is because we believe we can achieve these objectives on a very cost-effective basis by changing the rules of the game. So we will, so I'll give you an example of how the system can be both cleaner and cheaper, maybe two quick examples. So right now, the system is built so that all your appliances in your house can go on at the same moment. Now they don't, but some number go on at the same time. Well, there certainly can be chips in all those appliances so that your washing machine and your air conditioner can cycle off moments at a time. You would never notice the difference. But what happens is that the current system, in order to satisfy this peak demand, power plants have to be turned on, and not only is it really expensive, some of the power plants that are turned on to satisfy the peak can be diesel plants, can be the most dirty kinds of plants. So by having chips installed, you'd have a system which would be cheaper because there'd be less peak power produced, and it would also be cleaner. Or always hear about the intermittency of wind and solar of renewables. Well, And so the way we've been deploying renewables is to have a lot of fossil fuel backup to deal with those renewables, which is also kind of tying up all this capital. So let's imagine instead a system which can exist by changing the rules and the financial incentives, which we are doing, where intermittency is paired with demand response or demand management, so that you need less of that fossil fuel backup. So that's another example of being able to integrate more renewables into a system, an integrated system, where it'll be cheaper and cleaner.
And the renewables that you're adding, though, explain, what will they be? You expect primarily wind, primarily solar, distributed? What
it's
will be the power?
It's going to be a combination, but it's going to be a significant amount of onshore wind. In the 2020s, excuse me, there will be offshore wind, and one of the benefits of offshore wind in New York is that's close to the population center, and solar.
Yeah. When all of this is done, will electricity costs be higher or lower for average families, and will the total burden on the bill be higher or lower? Because presumably, even if the costs are higher, the burden could be lower if you're using less. What do you anticipate? What will happen on the costs as you meet these goals?
A key element is affordability, and it's of course one of these things where, and you know this, Ron, from other kinds of government about government programs and budgets, because it's always about what it would have been. Well, we're on a trajectory of the system becoming more and more unaffordable, business as usual, and so we're quite confident that it will be certainly more affordable than it would have been under business as usual, and we believe we can use really substantially the current cost envelope of the bill to finance the system of the future.
Now, as part of the REV process, you have spent a lot of time thinking about how you ensure that the benefits of both clean energy and efficiency extend not only to upper middle class communities, but also to lower income communities. And in May, you announced a big policy on affordability. One key element, more discounts for low income utility consumers. But the release on the policy said, quote, reducing the energy burden of low-income households and ensuring their participation in the clean energy economy cannot be accomplished through rate discounts alone and requires a more comprehensive strategy.
Yes.
What does that look like?
Okay, well, so let's just sort of dimension this. 1 million New Yorkers have difficulty paying their electric bills. 1 million people. We have $800 million of bills in arrears. And this is only getting worse. We cannot achieve the goals that we just talked about, 50% renewables by 2030, 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030 over 90 levels, without the participation of the low and moderate income communities. It's not going to be possible. And when I talked about the objectives that when the governor called, it's for all New Yorkers. But as in other examples, vulnerable communities are the first to experience problems that everybody else experiences. So the things that I've been talking about are really driven by not thinking about treating the solution to low-income customers as a bolt-on. It's just give a grant. We don't have enough grants, and that's not dealing with that's dealing with a symptom trying to solve. So I think a comprehensive approach, or beyond what I've been talking about, because what we're talking about is quite comprehensive. But we want to give maybe one example of rethinking something. When we think about retrofitting multifamily housing, multifamily low-income housing, the current approach is from grants. We do a few thousand a year. That's really great. It's not scalable. So instead, what we're going to do is to have, borrowing a program that's been successful in Europe, is to go and do a design competition and approach the variety of owners of low-income housing, multifamily housing, and ask them what it is that they need for a retrofit. And this has, again, been a program that was successful in the Netherlands. And by creating a large market for retrofits, what happened in the Netherlands is there was a design competition that resulted in an external building envelope for housing, so the tenants didn't have to move out. It had a significant reduction in energy efficiency, improvement in health benefits, and that's the kind of program that we're going to be launching later in the year, and that will have the effect of being able to retrofit hundreds of thousands of units.
No, I was going to ask you, maybe that's part of the answer, which is, a lot of people thinking about these issues often talk about the split incentive problem. How do you provide benefit for renters? How do you create incentives for landlords who are often simply just passing through the cost? How do you create incentives for them to engage?
Okay, so here's another idea, and this is something we're thinking about, so I want to say that it's in the context of thinking about it. So I talked about changing utility incentives before. Maybe this is a good idea would be to, generally in New York, we're not permitting utilities to own distributed energy solutions. I don't need to go into all the reasons for that. But maybe what would make sense would be to give the utilities the opportunity to put in the rate base, which is of course their business, all investments related to improvements in a building. Insulation, windows, all that. But in that, it would have controls that would enable the load in that building to be adjusted to satisfy the thing's peak demand. And so this kind of approach, particularly in so many grid-constrained areas in the state, might actually wind up not only having the ability to retrofit a lot of rental single-family homes, which people rent, which are going to be difficult to scale up otherwise for the split incentives. Not only do more of that, but actually might cost the system, might be very economic, because when delivering power in grid-constrained areas is really expensive. And if you can create energy efficiency and the ability to adjust the load in these locations, it reduces costs for everybody.
I want to bring in the audience. I want to ask you two final things before I do. What is the role of the EPA Clean Power Plan in your vision? Does that impede, advance? How does that fit into what you're trying to do?
We were embarked on this approach before the EPA reported the Clean Power Plan. So we obviously endorse it, but
does it make it easier? Does it make it harder?
It doesn't
affect you one way or
doesn't
the other?
affect us. I mean, I think just maybe for everybody, what I would say in terms of the federal government versus the state government is that there's this divided regulatory authority between the federal government and states when it comes to the power sector. So the federal government regulates wholesale markets, power generation. States regulate distribution and around retail markets. And that made a lot of sense in a time when there's a line of demarcation where electrons float in one direction. It makes less and less sense when we think about this new grid where electrons flow in multiple directions. And you have mini power plants, you have solar, you're kind of a mini power plant, you're producing power, it makes less and less sense. So all the authorities that the changes we're making are being done at the state level using state authorities. So states have a tremendous amount of influence in doing all the stuff that we're trying to do. And so it would be helpful at some time to take up this idea of what's the new regulatory partnership between the states and federal.
Final question before we bring in the audience. There is obviously, as you know, a tug of war underway in many states between utilities and solar companies over net metering. And one of the milestones you've reached as part of this REV process in New York is you have found, as they would have said in the 1990s, a third way. Explain a little bit about what you're doing and whether it's a model for other states.
Well, so and of course is the net metering battle. So really it goes to the question about location, because as I said at the beginning, what we've been doing with distributed energy solutions is we've been bolting it onto the system, and so in some cases the distributed solutions have a lot of value for that customer. They can save customers money. You know, depending on the system, you have a fuel cell, it has better power quality, more resilience. So it can be good for those customers. The question is it good for all customers? And the answer to that question is it can be good for all customers depending on location. And so that's what we have. And so there are really two elements to why the solar industry and utilities have found common ground in New York State. One is the idea that there's going to be an increasing emphasis on deploying distributed solutions in locations and appropriate pricing so that it's valued by location. And the other thing is the opportunity for utilities to earn, not by owning solar, but by helping to promote solar and again, since we talk about locations, I've said it now several times, in certain locations there are meaningful cost savings that utilities can earn from. And so it means that utilities and solar companies now can view each other as partners and customers of each other as opposed to the enemy.
Have you been, you think this is a model for other states? Or
Well, well, if it happens in New York, it can happen anywhere.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, we think that we believe that this is a pro-growth, pro-consumer model that not only in other states, but I've had the opportunity, I was with people from Brazil yesterday. Because we've exported the same policy and regulatory model around the world. And everywhere in the world, there's the same pressure. You talk to people in Brazil,
Yeah.
They're worried about net metering in Brazil, and they're worried about net metering in India. And so we have to come up with approaches. We believe we've come up with approaches that can work lots of places.
Let's bring in the audience. Question over here in the back.
Well, with Tax Equity Advisors, I'm wondering about community solar. There's a lot of talk about it, and I think it means different things to different players. So sort of what does it mean in the context of what's happening in New York, and what do you envision its future?
Okay, so we do have community solar in New York, and the initial community solar projects have a certain percentage of low-income customers that need to participate in those programs.
Required.
So I think that, again, the issue, that's sort of community solar, 1.0. Community solar 2.0 isn't just thinking about solar, it's thinking about a distributed energy solution that's right for that location, that may take into account storage, take into account demand management related things that are associated with those customers perhaps. And it also will take into account not it just being a regulatory mandate, but again, because we now have changed the compensation systems, again, by location, there'll be the opportunity for utilities to help earn some of the savings that will come from the deployment of that distributed solution.
Another question.
Hi, I'm Alex Breckel from the Department of Energy. You emphasize providing locational incentives for distributed solutions, generation, or efficiency. I was wondering how the REV process envisions that, ensuring equity in providing locational incentives. Social demographic groups are location-based, and if the cost and benefits of these distributed solutions are potentially higher in lower-income neighborhoods, do you envision erecting higher barriers to distributed generation adoption, for example?
I think it's in fact maybe the other way around, right? I think that many low-income people live in areas where there are issues in the grid, and very substantial value. And by the way, what we're talking about is the utilities are, some people are saying we're moving too fast, some people we're moving too slowly. So I want you to think about it as direction. Over time, there'll be, we'll get better and better at price signals, but the idea is gross price signals by location. And I hear the concern. I really think that that one of the challenges that we have if we're going to achieve scale is, as a policy matter, we need to know what programs and what approaches are going to be good for what. So a lot of what I've been talking about are market-based solutions. Well, not everything is going to be solved by the market. And so it means let's think about it in a holistic way. And so so if we still, right now we're clearly on the path to major inequities. And so the approach that we're taking, we think, is going to absolutely do a much better job in terms of equity. And so the question is but we'll need to then add some things. That's when you think about adding policies to deal with where the policies are not quite working, as opposed to what we're doing now, which is a kind of patchwork and add-ons.
Let me follow up maybe as a final point with a specific example of maybe following up on that question. There was interesting, about a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago, you had the Public Service Commission decided, rather than building a new substation, $1 billion substation, to meet power needs in Brooklyn and Queens, and maybe I'm asking this as a Queens native, yep. You decided not to build the substation and instead to have a demand management, decentralized power. Talk a little bit about, this is kind of taking the rubber meeting the road here. You're not building a new power plant, you're trying to find a new way to meet the need.
So thank you, Ron. So this is, and to be clear, this was Con Ed, the utility, that did this, thanks to, they deserve all the credit. It was thanks to the policy. So load growth in Brooklyn and Queens, business as usual, $1 billion substation. So instead, Con Ed went to the market with this problem and some also data about the system in that location and asked market participants to come back with solutions. Unusual for utility. Utility usually says, we know what the problem is, this is what we're going to do. So it was a more open source process. And what came back from Con Ed was a range of solutions, included demand response, energy efficiency, solar, combined heat and power, and those range of alternatives are going to cost $200 million. So all customers benefit because there's less money spent on the system. All customers benefit because there's less peak power procured, which is really expensive in New York City, you can imagine, during the summer. And it's a cleaner solution. So we know that this can work. And so we don't need a lot of high tech to know where there are grid constraints. We don't need a lot of high tech to know when utilities have to commit capital. So you can imagine this kind of process occurring just more often.
Oh, interesting. Mr. Kaufman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Policy development, as well as investments in energy efficiency, innovative business models, and bill assistance help lower the cost of clean energy. Our next panel will focus on ways to keep clean energy. So joining us now are Trenton Allen, Chief Executive Officer of Sustainable Capital Advisors, Jim Barrett, Chief Economist at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, and Priya Jayachandran, Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Multifamily Housing Programs for U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And returning to lead this conversation is the Atlantic's Ron Brownstein. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you all for joining us. We know we're living in a great moment for renewables, where we have the cost coming down, particularly solar, and we have all sorts of policy incentives that are encouraging more consumers to switch over to clean energy. We know that energy efficiency is actually one of the untold success stories, I think, of the country over the last 30, 40 years. I think the amount of energy we consume per dollar of GDP is exactly half the level that it was in 1980. The question we're here to discuss today, though, is how do you ensure that low-income families are sufficiently benefiting from these gains? And if they are not, what are the incentives that can kind of bring them into this revolution? So Jim, let me start with you, because you did a comprehensive report this spring, and it found that in the major metro areas, low-income households pay a bigger share of their overall income in energy costs than average or high-income families, and that blacks and Latinos also paid elevated shares relative to whites. But especially low income to high income. So what are the principal reasons why we see this kind of disparity.
Well, that's right, Ron. What we found when we looked at the top 50 urban areas in the country, low-income households paid 3 times more than non-low-income households for their energy. And African-American households with an African-American head of household paid more than 50% more than their counterparts across the income spectrum. So it's both a poverty issue and, frankly, it does come out as a racial issue. The disparity was less stark for Latino families. What we also found was that some of the worst offending cities, if you will, Memphis, New Orleans, Alabama, Birmingham, and Atlanta, have some of the lowest energy prices in the country. And we found that if you up those households to what we would consider to be the average efficiency, the median efficiency of their non-low-income counterparts, you could solve, for low-income households, you could solve a third of that excess burden. For African-American households, you can eliminate over 40% of that burden, right? And the same holds true for, in the multifamily space. You could almost eliminate the excess energy burden.
Renters, you said you could virtually eliminate it, right?
Yeah, you can virtually eliminate it by bringing just up to the average energy efficiency. So yes, it's an income problem. Obviously, low income is part of the discussion, but it is a housing stock problem. They live typically, as you would expect, in just less substandard.
And I was going to let me follow up because obviously we're all familiar with the McMansion phenomenon. Houses are getting bigger. Upper income people are living in bigger and bigger space. So it's kind of surprising in this sense that it's a bigger share of the burden. But one of the things you found that was the per square foot utility cost for lower income households was actually substantially higher.
Substantially higher. That's right.
Talk about that.
Well, that is a large driver of this issue. I'm not sure how else we can put it. You can solve a large part of this problem by a chunk of this is due to the fact that they, per square foot they pay more for their utilities, and we're talking here non-transportation energy costs. So I'm sure the transportation is an additional.
And is the principal reason for that disparity the housing stock? Is it the appliances inside the roughly 25% more per square foot, $1.23 to 98 cents?
Yeah.
So what explains a disparity that big?
Well, the data doesn't tell us exactly what the problem is, but in all likelihood, it's all of the above.
All of the above.
Right? These are older houses built to building codes, efficiency codes from years and years ago. Older appliances that are just haven't kept up with technology, and they're expensive.
Yeah, Priya, Trent, let me bring you in here. Why is it so hard to extend the benefits and efficiency which we're seeing across the economy to low-income households? Priya?
In the past, and we are at HUD trying to change some of this, but some of it is the incentives for owners to make those improvements in the first place. It's a part of our division in the Office of Multifamily at HUD oversees the project-based rental assistance portfolio. Many people think of that as project-based Section 8. There's a smattering of other programs, and it's very complicated, a complicated formula of how utility costs are shared between tenants and owners, and the way that savings are recognized. So historically, there haven't been a lot of incentives for owners to implement. We're trying to change that, and we've done a number of things to try and get our owners of affordable housing to invest in those energy efficiency improvements that makes the whole building more efficient, and then will translate to lower costs for the tenants.
So what are some of the strategies for doing that? What are some of the incentives that can in fact provide a nudge for an owner to improve the efficiency of the overall building?
Yep, so our biggest one we launched in January of this year. Ted Toon is sitting here. He was the architect of that for us, and it was really the biggest carrot we could offer owners who use our FHA multifamily financing to get up to a 75 basis point reduction in their mortgage insurance premium every year for achieving one of, I think it was 7 industry standards for. We ran some numbers back of the envelope, and what we found is that to achieve one of those standards, I think the assumption is it roughly costs 2 to 3% additional costs. through the extra leverage of that big reduction in your financing costs, you could support up to about 4% more in proceeds. So really no reason for somebody not to do this. It pays for itself. At the same time, we published our willingness to underwrite up to 75% of energy savings due to any energy efficiency improvements. That really pushed the industry. I think the highest out there was 50%. We really looked at the MacArthur study a few years ago and other research that shows how much those upfront energy audits have improved, and think that, you know, by underwriting that 75%, you're getting extra leverage there. So no reason for somebody not to do it. Another thing that we are starting to do, I heard one of the prior panels talk about benchmarking. We are moving forward with starting to publish a program that would require our owners, both on the assisted and our borrowers, to benchmark their portfolios. So to show us their energy consumption and thereby and compare it to other like properties and portfolios, and thereby hopefully start to make different decisions in the future. Future policymakers at HUD may consider carrots, additional carrots based on are proceeding under the assumption that information is good, that just by virtue of having the information, so we'll require the information, and then hopefully what we've seen, and I've read research that shows that just by virtue of having access to that data, people make up to 2% different changes in their consumption and costs just by virtue of seeing that data.
Well, as journalists, we believe it is in our economic interest when people think that information is good. Trent, talk a little bit about the private finance. What role can private finance play in reaching these consumers, these communities?
I think private finance can play an extremely important role in reaching these consumers. And I think it goes back to what Priya and some of the other panelists earlier were saying, that part of it starts really with our education and engagement of the customers. So once the customers have been educated and also engaged, then now you follow in sort of how would you actually implement these particular projects that they're excited to participate in. And I think that's where private capital can come in. To really think through sort of how do you provide financing opportunities to pay for these investments over time. One of the biggest hurdles with regards to uptake in clean energy has been sort of overcoming sort of that first cost. So how do you have enough capital, particularly when you think about from a low-income family standpoint, to pay for the energy efficiency improvements, to pay for the solar, having financial structures that allow for someone to pay for this over time and see immediate impacts with regards to reduction in energy costs. That's important not only to build the trust for other customers to come behind, but also to create sort of the economic incentives for people to continue on that path.
Probably worth here talking for kind of separating out for a moment, talking about owners, low-income owners, and then renters separately. You know, the ACEEE report. I mean, you note that most utility programs are aimed at homeowners, right? I mean, they are aimed at kind of convincing homeowners to make efficiency. What are the keys to making efficiency improvements, upgrades affordable to low-income owners? There are the on-bill models, there's the property tax models. What's shown the most success?
For low income, I think the real challenge, as Trent says, the upfront cost, doing it in a way that they can manage the payments. And it's really important to match the financial product if we're going to finance these costs, right? And for a lot of low-income households and communities, perhaps finance is not the issue. Perhaps the right solution is simply we need to subsidize them to bring their housing up to not just efficiency, but health and safety standards. The weatherization assistance program goes to low-income households, and they try to upgrade the homes for weatherization, and they find that the homes are simply not safe. So they need to do some simple remediation on basic issues before they can even think about how to make this house more weather resistant. So that's the first thing we have to recognize is that it may not be financing. It may just be we need subsidization. When you step into financing, then you need to make sure that you're building a financial product that matches the needs both of the homeowner and of the project itself. If you're pushed for 20 years and you loan them the money over 5 years, you've accelerated the payment so much that it's challenging for that piece of equipment to pay for itself on day one, for energy plus the loan repayment to be lower than their energy bills were before, just because you've got that accelerated payment schedule. So matching the capital structure to the project to the homeowner is challenging. It's not simple.
You, in 2015, the administration put together a pretty comprehensive plan, last July, I think it was, a year ago, on trying to increase access to solar for low-income families. There were FHA changes. There was also plans to directly install, 300 megawatts of renewable energy, I guess was the figure, in federally subsidized housing by 2020. Talk about that, if you could, kind of the different components of trying to bring more of the benefits of distributed energy to federal housing.
Yeah, so our Better Buildings Challenge, which is the Department of Energy initiative that was rolled out to multifamily properties and owners a couple of years ago, is probably our signature effort in this regard. In exchange for committing to reducing energy consumption by 20% over 10 years, we've been offering our owners various incentives. And you know, we've got about, I think, 100 owners in the multifamily sector who have signed up and are making improvements and getting toward that 20% goal, including on the solar side. I'm thinking of a National Housing Trust locally who did a property Channel Square that they recently installed solar panels on. You know, I think that the cost is in fact one of the big challenges, and that shared savings model with HUD. I think that, again, it goes back to that complication. I don't think that a lot of people realize that HUD itself spends $6 billion a year on utility expenses for low-income families through our utility allowance, both in public housing and in our rental assistance portfolio like project-based Section 8. And so because we spend a lot of that, a lot of the savings sometimes come back more directly to us than to the owner. And so how do they realize and achieve those savings that they're motivated to do it? I would say, you know, solar has been on the affordable stock, probably the one that's been a little bit harder to achieve. You know, we see a lot more investments in windows and low flush toilets, low pressure sinks, those sorts of things. You know, on the distributive side, I think that's probably the next envelope for us, and something that in terms of an energy agenda that the next administration will probably push on.
A perfect segue to a question we discussed a little bit at a dinner yesterday. When we think about extending, in particular, the benefits of solar to lower income communities, is the principal strategy, you think, trying to install panels home by home, or is there more of or is a community structure a more viable way to go, or both? What do you kind of look at?
Actually, I think the answer is both. I think you need to have both a strategy that looks to maximize solar on rooftops for homes that can accommodate it. So go back to the point that Jim made earlier. Some housing stocks may require additional work on roofs. They may have needs for updating electrical panels. And so the actual cost of solar isn't just the solar installation of the panels, but it's really an upgrade of the entire housing stock. And so the question is, who bears against? Currently, some of those costs aren't necessarily recoverable from federal tax incentives. And so as a result, the cost to that particular customer bears a little bit high. The ability to look at other types of structures like community solar, where you're now building a larger solar installation that is customers to participate in that particular installation and the benefits of solar, has the ability to not only allow you to get at what are some of these underlying costs that may dissuade some of the residential customers participating, but also opens it up to participants who live in condos, who live in apartment buildings, and also renters. And so really what community solar, sort of both pieces of that, allows you to get at what is sort of the opportunities for distributed energy, particularly around solar, and it can't necessarily just be one or the other.
If the dwelling is physically capable of receiving, or if you can put a solar panel on a roof, if the roof can take it, does it always make economic sense to do so, or are there valuation issues as well in terms of whether you can recover the value of the expense when you sell the house? Is that an issue at all?
It becomes an issue. It becomes an issue depending on the types of financing that you to for with the owners, but as these
Have you started to think about how kind of community solar would work in the public housing context and what that might look like?
I'm not sure, I'll be honest, I don't know if we have started to think about it in the public housing. For this administration, we've really been more focused over the last few years in reducing the energy costs, and I think that you know, taking it to the next level is probably the next frontier.
The next president. Jim, places that are finding through either states or cities that have found levers that work in terms of creating incentives, particularly for owners of multifamily housing to make improvements and also to have those improvements ultimately flow on to the renters themselves, the benefits of those improvements.
Well, you know, of course, it's tricky if you live in a master meter building versus a multi-meter building. Do the tenants pay their own energy bills? Do the building owner pay the energy bills and wrap that up into the rent? It's, you know, it gets very complicated. What I've found in talking to people in the field is that what we do not need new innovations in either technology, physical technology, or even financial technology. What we need is a stiff application of elbow grease. Every project is different, every building is different, every class of tenants in a multifamily building is different. So in some cases, we're talking to someone, they needed to do a boiler upgrade. But to do the boiler upgrade, first they wanted to look at the shell of the building, the outside. And then they discovered, well, if we do that, we're going to run afoul of, we were grandfathered in under the Americans with Disabilities Act for our front step. Because we upgraded the building and now it's no longer an old building, now we're, And so you get all of these strings of problems. You go to finance a building, you find that some of them have, I think, one project we were talking to had 12 mortgage holders in the stack. And they wanted to create a financial program which required consent from each one of those to put a loan that came in at number 13 for the energy efficiency. Really, really, really difficult. They managed to get the project done, but it was, there was nothing fancy about it, just hard work.
Is there any city or state that has gotten to scale yet in really creating a large number of multifamily places that have installed solar or made efficiency retrogrades in a way that benefit the rent? I know California just signed this AB 693, which is $100 million a year for 10 years. And the basic idea is what they will provide the solar panels or the efficiency upgrades so long as some of the benefit is passed back through to the renters?
Right, so there's programs like that. You've got really interesting work going on at the Connecticut Green Bank, the New York Green Bank, where they're working with the utilities who already have a well-established relationship with the customer, whether it's the building owner or the individual tenants, in designing utilities have been doing energy efficiency. They do most of the energy efficiency in the country right now, and have since we've started talking about this. So working with utilities on this has been a really effective strategy for folks in Connecticut and elsewhere to get projects done.
Let's bring in the audience. We have a couple questions out here. We have one back there, I think, to start. Oh no, okay. Okay, over here to start.
Hi, Will Tucker from Advocom Group. Earlier, Mr. Energy Czar, I have heard some energy advocates bring up nuclear as a solution, as a bridge here, and that's something I just haven't heard anything about today, and I think it, one way or another, certainly has to play a role in sustainability conversations. Do you all view nuclear solution mid-range to intermittency problems with renewable energy, such as solar or wind, or do you think that that's perhaps a path best not traveled?
Well, my organization doesn't have a particular opinion on nuclear versus any other energy. Energy. We did a study of delivering energy services out of the plugs in people's homes and businesses. Energy efficiency was by far the cheapest option for utilities to deploy. Right now, as Ron started, we frame this a little bit differently. More energy services in this country than every other fuel combined. So, what are we going to do? Are we going to, right? In the past, nuclear power plants have been very large, very capital intensive. If you don't hit very high usage rates, what they call capacity factors, they become quickly uneconomical. So as we move to a more distributed system, a more flexible system, is nuclear the technology suited to match that flexibility? I'm not sure. A lot of people talk about distributed energy with storage as a way to manage the intermittency. I know the battery technology might not quite be there yet, but maybe that's the way to look. I think there's a wide number of options. There may in fact be one of them, but it may or may not be the best. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back similar to solar rooftop, or I think it's all part of the solution. I mean, really, what we're talking about is how do we integrate both distributed technologies with the utility infrastructure that we have to best deliver consistent, reliable energy to customers. That's really what we're talking about. And so how's the best way to do that, and do that in a way that makes sure that those who are have lower incomes can either participate and have energy costs that are much more equitable. And I think that has to be part of the overall mix. It takes a holistic approach to get there.
Well, there's a final question. Implicit in a lot of what we've been talking about all morning, it hasn't been said, but often the structure of the conversation is about urban areas. It's about big, dense urban areas. Obviously, these are issues also in less dense areas, in rural areas. How does the challenge of creating more energy efficiency, engaging lower income families outside of urban areas differ?
Yeah, in fact, a large portion of our assisted rental stock is in suburban and rural areas, and so we are focused on this. I think one of the challenges is, frankly, access to you know, the PG&Es, I think they're an underwriter today, but didn't mean that. And some of the other ones have been on the cusp of providing this data and really working cooperatively with policymakers and with owners. It has been more challenging in rural areas with small utilities to get access to the data, to figure out what the problem is in the first place, and then think about how you change behavior. Is it at the owner level? Is it the tenant level? I mean, it really comes down to an access to data. California recently, you talked about legislation, California recently passed a law that I think requires all of the utilities in their state to provide whole building data. You know, that's great, but California was already, they've got benchmarking ordinances and other things. It's in those more rural areas where that access to data, which really underlies all of our improvements, and how Jim talked about that difficulty of whether it's master metered, tenant metered, or where the tenants pay, those challenges, but it really comes down to the data and cooperating with the utility companies. And we found that that's a little bit more challenging in those rural markets.
That was great. Listen, join me. Trent, Jim, Priya, and Emily, you're back for the next. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. What drives consumers to make smart energy choices? Is it values, politics, or economic incentives? Research suggests it could be as simple as finding out what your neighbor is spending on their own utility bill. And so in this panel, we'll learn how social pressure can be utilized to create more affordable energy bills. And here to bring this conversation to life is Jim Kapsis, Vice President of Global Policy and Regulatory Affairs at OPower, and Susan Mazer-Stoneman, cultural anthropologist and founder of Indicia Consulting. And my colleague Rebecca Rosen from The Atlantic will moderate this discussion. Welcome, everyone.
Hi again, everyone. Thank you so much, Jim and Susan, for joining us this morning. Let's just start with the basic idea that a lot of policies are designed kind of premised on the idea that consumers are going to behave rationally in some way. What does that look like in practice? Is that what we're seeing from consumers, just as a basic starting point?
I would say not true. If you look at the field of behavioral economics, behavioral psychology, it tells us that while historically we've thought that price signals and cost is really what motivates all of us, it's not that simple. And so we wouldn't have a business as OPower if that were the case, because sort of the idea that I think we helped pioneer, based on a lot of the research from the academic community, is that people respond to non-price signals. So like how are you doing compared to your neighbors when it comes to your energy use, which is something that OPower sort of brought to context, is one of these things that's very important and influences our purchasing patterns, whether that's energy or whether that's other types of consumer products. know, Susan, what do you think?
I totally agree. In fact, purchasing patterns is a really good example to bring up. One of the things that I like to talk about is that dead people do my grocery shopping for me. And when people look at me askance, I think, well, a lot of my purchasing decisions were made before I was born. I still buy things that my grandparents bought. I just grew up with them on the table, and I just live with them. That's my habit. My son is growing up with them. Life cereal, right? My son eats Life cereal because I ate Life cereal because my grandparents ate Life cereal. So I think most of us recognize that we're not rational creatures. However, when we put our policy hats on, we easily forget that because we need to put policies through, and policies need to have things like objectives and outcomes and measurable outputs. And so we forget that it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
And one of the things you were saying to me earlier is that a financial incentive can even sometimes work against you. Can you talk about that?
I can, but first I'll let Jim tackle that if he has any OPower information.
Go for it.
There's a lot of research about financial incentives. I'll just give two quick examples. One of which is that if somebody is already primed to do something from an altruistic perspective, maybe they're intrinsically motivated to help the environment or to be a good citizen, offering them money can subvert that impulse and make it feel like it's really they're being bribed to do something, or it may even feel like a job, and nobody likes their job, right? And the second way that it can backfire is that sometimes the amount of money is odd. So for example, we may think that we want to offer some people $500 to do something, and we think $500 is a relatively decent sized reward, but to that person it's both too large and too small. It's both not large enough to really recompense them for their time and trouble as they see it, but at the same time it's large enough that they feel maybe that they have to put in more effort than it was worth, and they would have been satisfied with a smaller amount. So financial incentives are trickier to implement.
Yeah. Did you want to have another?
I mean, I agree. I think we talk a lot about the difference between different kinds of motivation. So the extrinsic versus intrinsic. Extrinsic means like someone's going to pay you to do something, and that motivates you. Well, intrinsic means I'm going to do it because I think it's a good thing, it's the right thing. And what you don't want to do is take something people are already willing and motivated to do, and then pay them for it, because now they're only going to do it if they get paid for it, and that's not a good thing.
I think one of the flaws maybe in a lot of our thinking is also that like people behave the same, that consumers all will respond in the same ways to the same incentives. But one of the things we see in practice is that, I know Susan, you've looked at different personality types and how that might affect people. We also have cultural impulses, regional things. Can you guys talk about, and class obviously, which is a big part of today's conversation. Can you talk about what you're seeing, kind of the nuances of how this plays out across different demographic groups in our society?
Well, first I'd like to hear if Jim has any data on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to the question is sort of yes and no. So I think from a behavioral science perspective, so there's a friend of mine who's Paul Dolan is the head behavioral economist for the London School of Economics. And when I go to London, we grab beers, and he likes to kind of talk about the reptilian part of our brain, right? So this is the part of our brain we all share, we don't control, and it's sort of like that prehistoric hardwiring that in a lot of ways, particularly how we respond to different kinds of information, different kinds of messaging, and in that way, segmentation and those types of things don't matter as much. So, for example, if I show you a message that I want to motivate you, and I tell you that if you do this thing, you will avoid losing $100, right? That's actually more motivating than if I tell you, do this thing, and if you do it, I will pay you, if you're successful, $100. Because there's this concept called loss aversion, okay, which is literally hardwired into our brain. There have been countless studies starting with Daniel Kahneman, who's the Nobel Prize winner from Princeton, who looked at this years ago, which says that we are much more motivated, right, by the idea of trying to avoid losing something we already have, right, than seeking something that is regardless of right, class, race, language, country. It is the same for all of us.
Well, another way that we've talked about is that ideology can motivate people in different ways. We definitely have seen some research where The same messaging can backfire depending on the political leanings of the recipient, and it can have really different outcomes. And that's another reason why a lot of us in the behavior arena talk about framing the message in a way that reaches people and touches on the language that they use in their everyday, their values, their habits, the way that they think about their identity, and so forth.
What are some examples of that?
Well,
how would you frame it for different groups?
I'll give you a quick example. I actually was approached by a guy who does a lot of commercial landscape architecture in Southern California. Works in Orange County, fairly conservative, a lot of Republican clients, and he wanted to bring xeriscaping and drought-tolerant landscaping.
Can you just say a little bit more about what that
Yeah,
is?
just dry land landscaping, lots of native California plants, things that use very little water, but people were very resistant. It's seen as something that's kind of imposed, sort of a liberal hippie conspiracy maybe. And I talked to him and I said, you know, you can recast these concepts as American flowers, as oversight and control, you know, and those aren't lies, you know, it's just a different way of talking about it and reaching into their mindset and worldview and connecting.
Right, right. And you had also talked specifically about different personality types we're even seeing in the data.
So there's been, I think utilities are getting better and better, and Jim may have some information on this, about segmentation and personas. And people are starting, I know PG&E has done some work on personas, and our work in California for the California Energy Commission is similar in that we're looking at a group of 10 to 20% of the population.
Hypersensitives, is that what?
Cyber sensitives.
Okay.
They're people who really respond very positively to feedback about their energy consumption received through their electronic devices. And we think that about 10% of the population saves a really outsized amount of energy when exposed to information this way. Some of that data actually comes from Hunt Alcott, who's done a lot of work with O-Power, for example. We see this 10% cropping up in a lot of places. We think that it's a personality-driven aspect because it doesn't seem to have a demographic variable. It's not about affluence. It's not about regional persist across a lot of different groups of people. And we think that that might be a way to reach people.
Are you guys looking at that?
Yeah, well, I think some of these issues, we look at a lot of these issues. So like I totally agree on framing. Framing is important. And I think what you want to make sure is that the message you're trying to articulate doesn't get clouded by, we were a little startup. We made some mistakes, right? So, and we're always testing in the market, trying to understand what works and what doesn't. So I think two classic mistakes. One was, I don't know if folks who get this report from the utility, which shows you how you use energy compared to others. And if you're doing well, you get a nice smiley face on your report, whether that's an email or a paper report. So for an early client who won't be named, we used a frowny face. If you were doing so well, people did not like that, okay? And it wasn't even like, it was both demotivating as opposed to motivating, and they called the utility being like, why are you sending me a frowny face? Like, this isn't very nice. So we don't do that anymore.
It felt like they were getting a bad grade.
Right.
Yeah.
And to the point about different ideologies, while if you do the messaging correctly, there should really be no difference in how people respond to information. Certainly from an energy perspective, we have seen no distinction based on ideology. The only factor that really matters is how much energy you use. If you use more energy, you are more likely to save more when you receive a behavioral message than if you use less. That is like the biggest predictor of outcome. But that said,
is that just because you have the most room for improvement, or are these people more sensitive?
Well, I mean, I think the explanation is like people are more sensitive. It's hard to test exactly why, but I think that's a good theory. But on the green piece, right? So we have saved as O-Power 10 terawatt hours, which is like equivalent of taking more than 1 million homes off the grid for a year. More energy we saved last year than Tesla and SolarCity generated, okay, or saved, depending on how you want to calculate it. But we don't provide generally any green messaging in our outreach, because green messaging works great for people who are environmentally focused and sensitive, but it backfires with people who are not. But if you give non-environmental, non-green messaging to the greens, they still respond because they still get it, they understand and make the connection. But if they're not prone to that and not sensitive to it, it will also work without the green messaging. We put green in there, and there could be a negative association. So you have to kind of get rid of the noise that does kind of feed negatively into maybe people's ideology or preconceived notions.
And I'm sorry, I was just going to say there's research, UCLA research by Magali Delmas that was focused on exactly that many people who are resistant to green messaging actually are reachable through talking about their children, for example. So sometimes it's finding the thing that matters to them, and the middle income programs is actually talking to people where they are in the language that they understand, using peer champions that they respect.
And from you guys, you're also using the social transparency where people can see how their neighbors are doing. What are the kind of, how does that work on paper? What are people seeing, and what are the effects that you guys have noticed?
Yeah, sure. So what people are seeing is a comparison between themselves and people who are in similar size homes or apartments with a similar sort of energy mix with electric versus sort of gas, et cetera. And we have access to all that data. Most of that data is public, and then because we partner with utilities like PG&E, we have access to the energy data, which we process, and then you see a visualization of how you're doing. It's sort of a 3-bar chart relative to people like you, which we sort of refer to as your neighbors. It's usually 50 to 100 households, generally in your area. They're not actually the people next door. It's not Bob next. And then we also compare you to people who are efficient. So you can see how am I doing against the average, and then how am I doing against people who are really good. That's sort of the base. And then depending on how you do and how you're over time, we'll change that messaging. We'll use different types of language and different types of visuals to get you to try to, to save more over time. And with low income, I think it's really great about, behavioral types of interventions or nudges with let's say lower income folks is people who don't own their homes, which is not just lower income obviously, but are a challenge sometimes to reach because they can't go out and insulate their attic. They can't buy the appliance and install it. So what can they do? But information is something we can all receive, right? We can all be empowered with better information, and a lot of us just make, we're busy. We make decisions that probably are not optimal because we left the house, we had to drop, the kids at school, and it's 95 degrees, it's a DC day, and we kept the thermostat at 69 or 70 degrees, and we're not going to be home for 9 hours, and that's just buzzing away. You multiply that by 1 million customers, that's a lot of money being wasted. It's a lot of carbon, potentially being sent into the atmosphere. So this type of information is great because it can really access it.
Well, unfortunately, we've only got a few minutes left, but we'd like to open it up to the audience. So we got one right here in the front.
Hi, my name is Dave Wrench-McCauley. I work at the U.S. Department of Energy Sunshine Initiative. I wanted to ask, since a lot of this is about energy equity in low-income households, and we've recognized throughout this conversation that those households tend to be multi-tenant buildings where a non-tenant is actually the owner of the facility, what can behavioral science tell us about swaying the opinions of the decision makers in that scenario when the tenants are the ones who want something, but it may not benefit the owner of the building?
I guess I'd ask, how would it not benefit the owner of the building? Do you mean the split incentive, as in? That's a great question. I mean, I guess it would depend on the intervention that you were looking at. For one thing, there's interventions that renters can do. I rent, and I took advantage of a PEPCO program to put a programmable thermostat and get on a DSM program here, and that's something that renters can do. What we did when I was at ACEEE, we were working on a project in Tacoma Park on multifamily low income, and where we were really kind of digging deep and doing some really neat design work in terms of helping people have messaging in their homes that might stick around. One of the first things I would recommend is, and I might not be answering your question exactly, but is that whenever you're trying to establish a program that involves low to middle income, is you first have to begin by understanding the local conditions and the material reality. That actually means understanding what are those constraints, whether it may be a developer or an owner that is resistant, whether it may be older building stock that doesn't even have AC or doesn't have individualized control over AC or over furnaces, which you often find. So I guess my answer to your question is that you might have to find a local solution to that specific problem.
The agency problem is obviously a huge one in multifamily and in general in efficiency. One of the challenges I think we've seen in the market, particularly in multifamily buildings, is so many of them still in the U.S. and even worse overseas, they're master meters. each apartment doesn't actually have a meter attached to it. So you can't even really provide people with personalized information about their use because their bill isn't even really their bill. It's sort of an average, of the entire building divided by the units. And so what I think would be helpful, and I think through ARA, a lot of money went to deploy smart meters throughout the U.S. I think there are about 50 million now that are deployed. But I don't think we've seen as much as we maybe should have in the multifamily sector, and to try to kind of building by building, find ways to incentivize, whether it's the building owner or whether it's the municipality or whether it's federal agencies with appropriations from Congress, which are never easy to come by. Figure out ways to get those meters in those buildings, and then companies can take that data in partnership and deliver actual insights to the end users, to the inhabitants, right, to the residents, to help them use less. I'll also say what's interesting fact is that there's been research that's shown that just because you don't pay the bill doesn't mean you don't respond to behavioral messaging. So there's some work in the UK on this where one of the local housing authorities did an experiment with some of the economists that I know, and they looked at if we gave information behavioral, sort of similar to what Opower does, like here's how you do relative to others, even if they didn't pay the bill, they still use less. And it wasn't about the price incentive. It was about, wait a second, why am I wasting energy? That's silly, and why am I doing worse than the person next door?
We are out of time, but thank you so much to these wonderful panelists, and thank you to everyone who has come to hear them today.
Thank you.
Thank you. All of our speakers and our moderators for leading the conversation. I want to thank again our underwriter, PG&E, for making this conversation possible. And most of all, thank you to the audience for all of your great questions. And before you go, I have one small request. You'll get an email from me with a short survey. There's also hard copies. So if you can take a few minutes to fill those out. You've been a brilliant audience, and thank you so much for being here. Have a great morning.